"You're a gold digger," my fiancé's parents said at the rehearsal dinner. They had no idea I owned the building.
My name is Naomi Voss.
I was 28 when I learned that silence can be the loudest thing in a room. The rehearsal dinner was held in a restored brick warehouse downtown, the kind of place with exposed beams and hanging Edison bulbs, the kind of place people call authentic without knowing what authenticity cost. I remember the smell of candle wax and rosemary from the centerpieces. I remember the low hum of 40 conversations happening at once, and how none of them were about me until suddenly, all of them were. Richard's mother, Diane, stood with a champagne flute in one hand and a folded napkin in the other, the kind of woman who rehearsed her toasts in front of a mirror.
She smiled at me the way people smile at a stain they are trying not to acknowledge in public.
"We just want Richard to be happy," she said, her voice pitched for the whole room. "And we hope Naomi understands that a family like ours built everything from nothing. We know how it looks when someone comes into money they didn't earn."
A pause. Just long enough.
"You're a gold digger, sweetheart.
We see it.
We've seen it before." I didn't flinch. I want to be honest about that, because so much of what came after depended on that one moment of stillness.
My hands stayed folded in my lap.
My spine stayed straight. Richard's fork stopped halfway to his mouth, and his eyes found mine with something between panic and apology. I looked at the exposed brick walls around us.
The steel beams.
The century-old joists I had personally signed off on restoring 18 months earlier, back when this building was condemned and empty and nobody's dream but mine. Diane didn't know she was standing inside my investment portfolio. I smiled, small and unreadable, and reached for my water glass instead of my wine. "Thank you for sharing that," I said quietly. "I hope you enjoy the evening." Nobody at that table understood what I meant.
Not yet.
I grew up watching my mother stretch grocery money across a week that had 8 days' worth of hunger in it. We didn't have much, but we had discipline, and discipline is a strange inheritance, invisible until you need it. I studied urban planning almost by accident, drawn to the way old buildings held memory in their walls. My first job out of school was cataloging condemned properties for a city redevelopment office, walking through buildings nobody wanted, running my hand along water-damaged plaster, imagining what they could become. That warehouse, the one that would later host my own rehearsal dinner, was the first property I fought for. I remember standing in it 3 years earlier, dust drifting through broken skylights, and feeling something I can only describe as recognition.
Not of what it was, of what it could be.
I spent 2 years assembling investors, permits, contractors who believed in slow, careful restoration instead of gutting a building's soul for speed. I mortgaged more of myself than money, sleep, relationships, a version of my 20s that looked like other people's 20s. Richard came into my life during the last stretch of that project, back when I was still covered in drywall dust more often than perfume.
He liked that about me, or said he did.
He never asked exactly what I did for work beyond real estate stuff, and I never corrected the vagueness.
Some part of me, I think now, wanted to be loved without my accomplishments doing the talking.
I didn't yet know that vagueness would become a weapon in someone else's hands. The days after the rehearsal dinner passed in a strange, muffled way, like watching my own life through frosted glass. Richard apologized in the car, his voice thin with the kind of guilt that asks for comfort rather than offering it.
"She's just protective," he said.
"She doesn't mean it the way it sounded." I said nothing, because I was doing the math of it, not financial math, the other kind. The math of how many times he'd let a comment like that pass without correction. The math of how many dinners I'd smiled through while his family asked polite, probing questions about my background, my family money, my plans once we were married. That night, alone in my apartment, I sat on the floor with my back against the couch, the way I used to sit as a kid when the walls felt too close.
I didn't cry, not exactly.
It was quieter than that, a kind of internal folding, like a letter being creased along a line it would never fully lose.
I thought about the building.
About the version of me who stood inside its ruins 3 years ago and believed she could turn wreckage into something whole. That version of me had never needed anyone's permission to be taken seriously. I opened my laptop and pulled up the property documents out of habit more than intention, the deed, the LLC filing, the renovation permits with my signature on every page. I didn't do it for revenge.
Not yet.
I did it because I needed, for a moment, to remember who I was outside of a room that had decided who I must be. There's a particular loneliness in being underestimated by people who claim to love you. Over the following week, I noticed things I'd trained myself not to notice. The way Richard's father, Gerald, addressed me only when necessary. The way Diane referred to the wedding fund as though it existed solely through Richard's side. The way even Richard, gentle as he was, never once said, "Actually, Mom, Naomi owns the building we're standing in."
He knew. That was the part that sat heaviest in my chest.
He had known for over a year, since the day I'd shown him the deed with something like pride, hoping he'd carry that pride forward into rooms I couldn't always enter myself.
He hadn't corrected his mother.
He'd let her humiliation stand, unchallenged, in front of 40 guests. I called my old mentor, Esther, a woman who'd spent 30 years in commercial development and had taught me that dignity in business wasn't about proving people wrong loudly, it was about letting the truth arrive on its own schedule.
"You don't owe anyone your resume," she told me.
"But you also don't owe them your silence forever." I turned that sentence over for days. I wasn't interested in humiliating anyone. I'd seen enough of that at the rehearsal dinner to know I didn't want to become a mirror of it. But I also knew that some truths, once withheld too long, start to calcify into something unhealthy. For me, not for them. I decided the wedding venue contract, still sitting unsigned in my email, would be where the truth finally spoke for itself. Richard's parents had insisted on hosting the actual wedding at the same warehouse, charmed by its exposed brick and authentic character. Unaware they were charmed by my life's work. The venue contract required a signature from the property owner of record for final approval. Diane, coordinating logistics with her usual brisk efficiency, forwarded me the paperwork one afternoon with a short note. "Can you have the venue people sign off on this by Friday?
Richard says you know someone there."
I read that sentence 3 times.
Someone there.
I sat with my laptop open for a long while before I did anything. Not out of hesitation about the truth, but out of care for how it would land.
I didn't want fireworks.
I wanted clarity, the kind that doesn't need to shout to be heard. I forwarded the contract back to her with one addition, my own signature, beneath the line marked property owner, Voss Restoration Holdings LLC.
I wrote only one sentence in the email.
"I'm the someone who owns the building, happy to confirm anything you need for the file." Then I closed my laptop and went for a walk along the river, past other buildings I'd once considered restoring, feeling something settle in my chest that wasn't triumph.
It was closer to relief.
The relief of no longer holding a truth I hadn't needed to hide, except that fear and politeness had made it feel necessary.
I didn't send it to hurt Diane.
I sent it because I was tired of being smaller in rooms I had built. Diane called Richard within the hour. I know this because he showed up at my apartment that evening, pale, holding his phone like it had betrayed him. "Why didn't you tell them?" he asked, and there was something almost accusatory in it, as though my restraint had been the deception rather than his silence. "I told you," I said quietly. "A year ago. You had every opportunity to tell them, too." He sat down slowly, the fight draining out of him as understanding arrived late, the way it often does for people unused to consequences. "I didn't think it mattered where the venue came from."
"It didn't," I said.
"Until your mother used my supposed lack of money as a weapon at a party celebrating our marriage. Then it became the only thing that mattered, not because I need credit, Richard. Because I need to not be diminished by people who've never once asked who I actually am."
He didn't have an answer for that.
I don't think there was one that wouldn't have sounded like an excuse. I want to be honest, I didn't feel vindictive watching him struggle. I felt something quieter and sadder, the specific grief of realizing a partnership had been built on my willingness to shrink. "I'm not calling off the wedding," I told him, because it was true, at least in that moment. "But I need you to understand that dignity isn't something I'm willing to negotiate for comfort."
"Not yours."
"Not mine." He nodded, and for the first time in longer than I could admit, I saw something like real reckoning in his face. "Diane requested, insisted, really, on a private lunch before the wedding, to clear the air," her words carried through Richard like a diplomat's cable. I agreed, mostly for Richard's sake, though some part of me was curious what version of Diane would show up once the room wasn't full of witnesses. She arrived at the restaurant already speaking, an apology shaped more like a defense.
"I didn't know," she said.
"How could I have known?" "You didn't ask," I said simply. "Not once, in a year and a half. You assumed instead." She was quiet at that, turning her water glass in slow circles the way people do when they are looking for something to hold on to that isn't the conversation itself. "I don't need you to grovel," I told her, and I meant it. "I need you to understand that the assumption you made at that dinner wasn't really about money. It was about whose worth gets questioned by default, and whose doesn't." Something in her posture shifted, not full understanding, not yet, but the beginning of it. The kind of crack that lets light in slowly, over months, not evenings. "The building," she said finally, quietly. "It's really yours." It's really mine, I said. I restored it beam by beam when nobody else believed it was worth saving. I'd have told you myself, eventually, if you'd ever made room for the question. We didn't hug. We didn't manufacture forgiveness neither of us had earned yet. But we finished the meal in something closer to honesty than either of us had offered the other before. On the morning of the wedding, I stood alone for a moment in the warehouse before the guests arrived, running my palm along the same brick wall I'd first touched 3 years earlier, dust-covered and uncertain, believing in something no one else could yet see. The building didn't remember the rehearsal dinner the way I did. It simply stood, patient and restored, the way it had been designed to, a space built from ruin into something worth returning to. I thought about Diane's words that night, the accusation she'd handed me like a verdict. I thought about how easily I could have corrected her in the moment, and how much more meaningful it felt to let the truth arrive with its own quiet weight, on my own timeline, rather than as a defense performed for an audience. There is a particular kind of power in not needing to prove yourself in the moment you're underestimated. I didn't restore this building to win an argument. I restored it because broken things deserve patient hands, and because I understood, long before Richard's family did, that worth isn't inherited or married into. It's built, beam by beam, in rooms no one else is watching. Richard and I are still married. Diane and I are still learning each other, slowly, honestly. Some wounds don't need a dramatic ending. They need time, and truth, and the quiet dignity of a woman who never had to raise her voice to be believed. I own the building. I always did. I just chose, finally, when the truth would speak.